In Burkina Faso, the military-led government has detained 8 staff members of the Netherlands-based NGO, International NGO Safety Organization, on charges of espionage and treason.
They called it humanitarian work. Burkina Faso called it spying. 8 NGO workers, Europeans, Africans, all under one Western umbrella, now sit in custody in Ouagadougou, accused of collecting secret data for foreign powers. And suddenly, the aid industry is panicking, because this isn't just an arrest, it's a message. Africa's not a playground for Western helpers anymore. The masks are off. The era of pretending is over. Burkina Faso just declared war on the world's most polite form of espionage, NGO intelligence. But who exposed them? Let's find out. It started like another quiet evening in Ouagadougou. The announcement didn't come with hesitation. It came with precision. Security Minister Mahamadou Sana stood before reporters, his tone cold and deliberate. They collected and passed on sensitive security information to foreign powers, he declared. No room for ambiguity, no diplomatic sugarcoating. This was not just another NGO dispute. It was a declaration that the lines between aid and intelligence had finally been crossed. The organization in question, the International NGO Safety Organization, INSO, wasn't some obscure outfit. It was a respected European-based humanitarian network, working across conflict zones from Syria to Somalia, gathering data on attacks, ambushes, and risks to guide aid workers. But in the eyes of Burkina Faso's junta, that very data, the kind that mapped the pulse of national insecurity, had turned into something far more dangerous. The government said the NGO had been banned from operations since July 31st, after being caught collecting security information without permission. And yet, despite that suspension, INSO staff allegedly continued working, meeting secretly, and storing data that, according to the state, never should have existed. For the junta, that wasn't humanitarianism, it was defiance wrapped in diplomacy. In a country where every village road can be a target and every informant can cost lives, unapproved data isn't just paperwork, it's ammunition. When authorities moved in to detain the group, they did so quietly, long before the news broke. Among those taken were 3 Europeans, a Malian, and 4 Burkinabé, including the NGO's country director and his deputy, people who, until then, had been treated like partners of the state. But the moment their laptops and communication logs were seized, the narrative changed. The government saw coordination reports. The NGO called them safety assessments. But the ministry saw maps of sensitive regions, travel routes, and notes about armed groups, the kind of material that, in the wrong hands, could expose military strategies or aid enemy infiltration. It wasn't about what was collected. It was about who was seeing it and where it was going. INSO immediately denied the accusations, calling them categorically false. They said they existed to protect aid workers, not to undermine governments. Their representative, Anthony Neal, told the BBC that the NGO had ceased all data collection after suspension and was only in country to manage administrative matters. But to the Burkinabé authorities, those reassurances sounded all too familiar. The same diplomatic script Africa has heard for decades, every time sovereignty is breached behind the curtain of good intentions. Still, the timing wasn't random. Burkina Faso, under Captain Ibrahim Traore, has been in a political transformation, rejecting Western military partnerships, cutting ties with France, and reasserting control over every inch of national security. The country has been bleeding under insurgent attacks, many of which are mysteriously well coordinated despite constant Western assistance. To Traore's government, this arrest wasn't about punishing foreigners. It was about sending a message to every organization operating in Africa. If you're on our soil, you're under our rules. The tension that night was more than diplomatic. It was symbolic, a clash between 2 worldviews. One that sees Africa as a space to be managed, mapped, and monitored, and another that sees it as a sovereign force reclaiming its agency. The silence after Sana's press conference was deafening. Western embassies scrambled for statements, aid groups whispered of a new hostility. But inside Burkina Faso, something else stirred. A quiet pride. A sense that after decades of being watched, the country had finally turned the gaze back outward. And that's the question that now lingers like smoke over the Sahel. If even humanitarian data is now a weapon, what else has been used to monitor Africa all along? The real war in Africa today isn't for land, it's for knowledge. Who knows what, where, and when? That's the currency that shapes the modern battlefield. When the Burkina Faso authorities raided NSO's offices, they didn't just find laptops and files, they found a pattern, one that has been repeated across Africa for years. Maps marked with dots of conflict, logs of incidents in rural provinces, coded language describing local actors. It looked harmless. Safety reports for aid workers. But anyone who understands security knows that such information, once compiled, becomes a strategic map. Each incident report tells more than it claims. It shows where militants move, where the army is thin, and which regions are most unstable. And those patterns, when viewed from a global vantage point, reveal more than satellites ever could. In the hands of the wrong partner, that's the kind of intelligence that can topple a defense plan before it's even tested. That's why the Burkina Faso junta drew the line. To them, the so-called humanitarian data network was no longer just an observer. It was a silent player in the conflict itself. But here's the uncomfortable truth. INSO isn't alone. Nearly every international NGO in the Sahel collects data, not always for malice, but always for control. Each one insists their mission is neutral. Yet neutrality collapses the moment information leaves African servers and travels to Western institutions, where analysis is turned into strategy. The irony is, this system didn't begin under military rule. It began under democracy, with foreign partners embedding information-sharing protocols into donor contracts. That's how Africa's crises became Western datasets. And when Captain Ibrahim Traore's government finally pulled the plug on that open pipeline, it wasn't just a crackdown, it was a rupture. But the question then becomes, why did this data obsession start in the first place? Why do Western organizations need to monitor African territories down to the last roadblock? The answer lies in history's repetition, the transformation of empire into information. When Europe's colonial projects crumbled, they left behind a vacuum that was never truly empty. Instead of garrisons, came agencies. Instead of soldiers, came surveyors. Instead of occupation, came observation. The aim was the same: to understand Africa better than Africa understood itself. That's why the NSO incident feels like déjà vu, a mirror of what Africa endured for centuries, only now dressed in humanitarian logos and PowerPoint templates. Burkina Faso isn't just questioning an NGO. It's questioning an entire ideology. The belief that foreign institutions must always have a clearer picture of African security than Africans do. And the timing couldn't be more symbolic. The country has already rejected France's military presence and pivoted toward alliances built on mutual respect rather than manipulation. So when Traore's government looked at INSO's work and saw echoes of surveillance, it wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition sharpened by decades of exploitation. The shock in Western capitals wasn't about 8 people being detained. It was about a network being exposed. A network so deeply woven into Africa's humanitarian ecosystem that its removal threatens to blind the entire Western aid apparatus operating in the Sahel. But this brings us to the real turning point. If information has been the West's invisible weapon, then what happens when Africa seizes that weapon back? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. When Europe's flags were lowered from African capitals in the mid-20th century, a quieter invasion began. The same nations that once extracted gold and rubber began extracting information through census projects, research grants, humanitarian databases, and aid-driven surveys. Instead of soldiers with rifles, there were researchers with laptops. Instead of fortresses, there were data hubs. The African body was freed, but the African mind, its stories, statistics, and security remained under capture. Every Western power knew that whoever controlled the data controlled the decisions. If they could measure African poverty, they could define African need. If they could chart insurgencies, they could dictate security assistance. If they could collect information on refugees, they could control migration policy. In other words, data wasn't neutral. It was governance in disguise. This is why Burkina Faso's stand hits harder than the detainment itself. Traore's government isn't fighting humanitarianism. It's fighting the colonial architecture of information ownership. For too long, Africa's realities have been written in offices thousands of miles away. The Sahel's suffering has been quantified by people who've never felt the heat of its soil. Every death, every displacement, every instability statistic becomes a number in Western grant proposals. What Africans experience, Western institutions narrate and profit from. Consider this. When an African ministry wants access to its own conflict data, it must often request it from the very NGOs that collected it. Imagine that a sovereign state needs permission to view information about its own land. That's not cooperation. That's colonial dependency through code. And this system isn't accidental. It thrives on the illusion that Africa is incapable of managing its own crises, that it needs international expertise to interpret its own chaos. The narrative of incompetence sustains the funding. The statistics of disasters sustain the control. The machine only works as long as Africa remains the studied, never the student. Burkina Faso's rebellion cracks that illusion wide open. By calling out an NGO for collecting sensitive security data, the junta didn't just accuse individuals, it accused a system. It declared that the West's self-appointed role as Africa's observer was over. And for the first time in decades, it demanded something revolutionary: data sovereignty. A concept simple in theory, but radical in practice. The idea that Africa should own the data gathered within its borders, decide how it's used, and determine who benefits from it. The shockwaves this caused in Europe weren't about human rights. They were about the disruption of access. Western policymakers suddenly faced the unthinkable: an African government cutting their informational lifeline. Without that flow of constant updates, field reports, and assessments, the West can no longer manage African conflicts from afar. The result? Panic disguised as outrage. And here's the paradox. While Western media accuse Traore of paranoia, their own governments have laws banning unregistered foreign data collection. The United States, France, and the EU all criminalize unauthorized intelligence gathering. But when Africa demands the same respect, it's labeled authoritarian. That double standard is not hypocrisy by accident, it's design. Because if Africa begins to own its narrative, the global hierarchy of knowledge collapses. Who then will set the development agenda? Who will justify military presence? Who will write the next report about African instability without having Africa's data to base it on? Burkina Faso has forced that question into the open. The era of information extraction is ending, and a new one of information independence is being born. But as history shows, empires never surrender their tools easily. The next battle will be uglier, more strategic, and more psychological, because it won't be fought on the ground, but in perception itself. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. When a superpower loses visibility, it doesn't go blind, it panics. That's exactly what happened the moment Burkina Faso slammed shut its informational gates. The West, accustomed to peering into every African village through monitoring networks, suddenly found its eyes gouged out. And for the first time, the flow of intelligence didn't just pause, it reversed. The outrage came quickly, but it wasn't the kind born of morality. It was the sound of a system cracking. European officials called the arrests unfounded. Western think tanks published urgent analyses about shrinking humanitarian space. Aid agencies warned that data restrictions would hamper safety operations. Yet beneath the noise, one thing was clear. It wasn't the welfare of Burkina Faso that worried them. It was the loss of access. To understand the hysteria, you must understand the machinery behind it. For decades, every Western operation in Africa, from military planning to foreign investment, has relied on constant streams of NGO-generated data. That's how risk maps were drawn, how policy assessments were justified, how foreign embassies positioned influence without needing troops. NGOs were the soft scouts of geopolitics, never uniformed, always unarmed, but infinitely more useful. Now imagine that entire system collapsing overnight. No more daily field reports. No more local incident logs. No more quietly extracted context briefings for Western embassies. In a single move, Burkina Faso had unplugged an empire's informational lifeline. And in geopolitics, that's not just inconvenient, it's catastrophic. That's why Western officials didn't just complain, they coordinated. Behind the scenes, diplomatic cables began to circulate. Paris sought explanations. Brussels hinted at sanctions. Washington questioned whether Burkina Faso's security cooperation should continue. None of this was about the detained aid workers. It was about the precedent. Because if one African nation could shut down the NGO pipeline and survive, what would stop others? Mali has already expelled French troops. Niger followed. The Central African Republic banned several Western charities suspected of political interference. The pattern was spreading like a storm front, and Burkina Faso's defiance was the lightning bolt that made it visible. The Sahel was no longer the playground, it was the front line. The Western narrative machine kicked in instantly. Major outlets framed Traore's government as increasingly repressive. Human rights groups issued warnings about freedom of association. Experts were wheeled out on international media to call it a dangerous slide toward authoritarian isolation. But beneath that outrage was something else: fear of irrelevance. Because if the Sahel's new leadership bloc, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, could collectively manage security intelligence without Western mediation, then entire institutions like the UN's peacekeeping divisions, the EU's training missions, and France's counterinsurgency operations would become obsolete. The balance of who interprets Africa's wars, who defines its dangers, and who writes its future would shift permanently. That's the real reason for the uproar. The West isn't losing influence because Africa is suddenly radical. It's losing influence because Africa is learning to think, plan, and secure itself without permission. And perhaps most revealing was the silence that followed the initial condemnation. After the outrage faded, there was no real retaliation, just murmurs, hesitation, and vague talk of reviewing partnerships. Because deep down, even Western analysts understood what had just happened. The age of one-way observation was dying. Burkina Faso had turned the telescope around. What they see now, looking back, is uncomfortable. They see a continent that no longer needs validation, a people who no longer panic when aid disappears, and a generation of leaders willing to risk diplomatic fallout for sovereignty. The myth of Africa's dependence has met the reality of Africa's defiance. And yet, while the West scrambles to repair its broken lens, another question now burns through the continent. If Africa finally controls its own intelligence, can it build a new model of cooperation, one that protects sovereignty without isolating itself? The continent is awakening to a truth too long ignored, that sovereignty isn't only about territory or trade, it's about who owns the truth. In the 21st century, information has become the new mineral, mined from African soil under the label of research, processed in Western think tanks, and sold back to Africa as policy advice. Burkina Faso's rebellion breaks that cycle by doing what every independent nation should do, demanding ownership over what's known about it. But this awakening isn't isolationist, it's visionary. Traore's administration isn't just closing doors, it's opening new ones, to cooperation that respects sovereignty, to partnerships rooted in mutual benefit, not surveillance. Already, his government is pushing for a regional security intelligence alliance with Mali and Niger, where data will flow horizontally between African nations instead of vertically to foreign capitals. The concept is simple but revolutionary: Africa sharing with Africa. This transformation means a total overhaul of how intelligence, development, and aid are managed. Imagine African states building their own safety coordination networks, staffed by local analysts, powered by regional servers, and funded by their own treasuries. Imagine humanitarian work guided not by Brussels or New York, but by Accra, Bamako, and Ouagadougou, where the people closest to the crisis shape the response. That's not nationalism, that's realism. The age of dependency is finally giving way to the age of self-definition. And this shift is already echoing beyond the Sahel. Across the continent, governments are starting to review NGO laws, tighten data-sharing agreements, and audit foreign-funded projects that operate in the shadows. Kenya's parliament is debating stricter digital sovereignty legislation. South Africa is pushing for local data storage mandates. Even small island nations like Mauritius are demanding that development agencies host servers inside their borders. The message is spreading. Africa no longer trusts global neutrality. The West sees paranoia. Africans see pattern recognition. For decades, aid has been weaponized to track, predict, and sometimes even destabilize regions that dared to resist. But when the observer becomes the observed, the narrative flips, and with it, the balance of fear. That's what makes Burkina Faso's defiance so dangerous to global elites. It sets an example. Because once one African nation reclaims control, others will follow, and the entire colonial algorithm begins to fail. Still, this new chapter won't be easy. True sovereignty demands discipline, building data infrastructure, training cybersecurity experts, and crafting laws that protect citizens without suffocating transparency. It means ensuring that in rejecting manipulation, Africa doesn't replace foreign control with local corruption. The challenge is to build systems that are both independent and accountable. That's where leadership must evolve from resistance to reconstruction, from fighting external control to mastering internal capacity. And perhaps that's the greatest irony of all. While the West accuses Traore of silencing freedom, he is actually forcing the continent to rediscover a deeper one, the freedom to know itself on its own terms. For centuries, Africa's image was drawn by outsiders, missionaries, explorers, colonizers, and consultants. Now the continent stands on the verge of painting its own reflection. Not a perfect picture, but an honest one. The story that began with 8 detained NGO workers is no longer about them. It's about a continent waking up to the weight of its own information and the power of its own autonomy. Because in this new age, the greatest revolution isn't fought with weapons, it's fought with who controls the narrative. And for the first time in living memory, that control is shifting southward. The West is watching, but for once, Africa is not performing. It's writing. And that right there is the birth of a new chapter, one where Africa is no longer the subject of reports, but the author of its own reality. Do you think Burkina Faso's defiance marks the beginning of a new African order, or just another chapter in an old struggle? Let us know in the comments section. Should Africa rebuild its own intelligence network to protect sovereignty, even if it means cutting ties with the West? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.